and it's in the breaking. We come unbound, and it's in the giving. We are found, yeah. You could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you tried.
In episode 43 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, I welcome the creator and host of the top-rated, evidence-based personal growth podcast, a visionary leader in the self-improvement movement, Matt Bodner. Outside of hosting the podcast, The Science of Success, Matt is a partner at early-stage investment firm, Fresh Hospitality, where he focuses on deal-making and strategy. In this podcast, Matt leads us into explorative discussion of our current education system, pointing out, through personal experience, some of the key inefficiencies and downsides of our modern education. He then guides us into the role of lifelong self-directed learning and shares much of his recent dive into speed reading and how to remember more of what you read and learn. Expanding from this, Matt offers his evolutionary hypothesis for learning and explains why we have a much greater capacity to encode and retrieve associative visuospatial memory over concrete words and objects. We then move into a discussion of Matt's podcast, The Science of Success, and explore his definition of evidence-based personal growth. He shares some of the most insightful wisdom he has gained from these conversations and the importance of being a curious and purposeful listener. Matt explains why he believes the two most important practices one can engage in are building self-awareness and learning how to effectively deal with challenging and negative emotions. Matt ends the show sharing a few of the wonderful free resources available on the Science of Success homepage that seek to help you become a better decision maker and empowered learner. This was once again another serendipitous and thought-provoking podcast, and I am incredibly grateful to have connected with Matt and to be able to share his wisdom and work with you. And with that, let's dig into the show. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining me today for a podcast. I'm really excited to have you on to share some thoughts with our audience.
Yeah, it's awesome to be on here. Thanks so much for having me.
We were talking a little bit before the show, and I didn't realize you actually went to school at Richmond, so kind of fairly local anyway, and sharing some geographic ties. But I came across your work fairly recently, and would love it if you wanted to share a little bit about who you are and what you're doing currently, because it's quite unique. I should say, and warn people.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I don't know how much you know about my full background, but primarily, I guess you're talking about the podcast that I'm the creator and host of, which is called The Science of Success. And so that show is all about what we call evidence-based growth, which is basically thinking about how can we kind of take the lessons from science and research and data and apply those to practical applications for the way people live their lives and improve their lives and think about, trying to achieve their goals and be happier and all those kinds of things. I'm happy to kind of dig into how that got created. I'm also, that's kind of actually sort of a side project. I'm actually an investor primarily, and a partner at an investment firm that invests kind of across the food value spectrum. So we invest in stuff like farms and restaurants and land and all kinds of things, which I'm also happy to dig into. But yeah, that's kind of my background. The show has been a really, really cool project. We launched about 2 years ago. just almost randomly. And I call myself an accidental podcaster, actually, because I never really knew much about the medium or set out to do it. And it ended up taking off and getting a lot more traction than we thought it would. And that was, like I said, it was about 2 years ago. And since then, we've really been super excited about kind of everything that's gone on with the show, and had some really, really cool guests on in kind of the psychology and the neuroscience and decision-making world. And, we continue to look for really interesting, exciting people to talk to and interview.
Well, I will certainly say you guys have some incredible guests, a lot of whom have been at least exposed to, whether in other podcasts or books, and some of the conversations you've had on the podcast have been incredibly enlightening and very practical. I think you guys take a very sort of realistic and practical approach in those conversations, and I'm just guessing that's probably why people have latched on and it's been as successful. I think just in general that this space, people are wanting some degree of distilled wisdom or ways to really optimize or improve their well-being, kind of recognizing we've created a two-edged sword. We sort of have this great technology and technological capacity, but at the same time we can get stuck staring at our phones 24/7 and be crippled to even make a decision. But I figured before we go into some of those arenas, was curious if there was anything in your childhood in particular, or any sort of early life experience that kind of pushed you in this direction, in terms of wanting to kind of really find what it is that is going to help us be better human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I definitely had some kind of interesting and formative experiences as a child. I would say there's two main things from sort of early childhood, and then another thing from kind of high school that I think were really formative in shaping the way that I think and view the world. One of them was I was partially homeschooled as a kid. So from about kindergarten through 5th grade, my parents we lived in Colorado at the time, and my parents would take me out of school at the end of Christmas break, basically, and we would go to Florida, and they would basically like live in Florida for 3 months, and my mom would homeschool me for that quarter of the year. And it was really, really interesting, and it kind of reshaped the way that I thought about a lot of stuff. Mostly kind of just pulling me out of the school system. I think taught me a lot of lessons about how life can be sort of more malleable, more negotiable, more flexible than people often realize. And you don't necessarily have to follow the rules and the structures, and you can actually get sometimes even better results. And my mom would probably teach me like a couple hours a day, like 2 or 3 times a week, and I would come back ahead of the class in terms of all the stuff that they were working on. So
yes,
yeah, so that was a really interesting experience for me, and it kind of really opened my mind to thinking outside the box and realizing like, hey, maybe the way that we've always done it isn't the best way, or there's new alternative paths. So that was one big piece of it. Another piece is that I'm fiercely competitive. And I've got 3 older siblings, and my brother and actually I have 2 brothers and a sister, and they're substantially older than me. They're half siblings, and so they're like 15 to 20 years older than me. And when I was growing up, they would basically just destroy me in any kind of competition that we would have. And like,
yeah.
I remember one of my brothers giving a speech at my wedding, and he was talking about how he would just crush me in Street Fighter. So like the old Super Nintendo game, we'd play Street Fighter.
Man, yeah.
And they would just dominate me, like crush me mercilessly over and over again. And I think for some reason that like ruthless destruction just made me like really, really competitive, because now I'm just like hyper competitive person. And so I think that fueled a lot of my interest and desire in self-improvement and always getting better and always trying to learn and improve and be the best. And then the third one, which is more kind of shaping about how I think about the world, was I was a debater in high school, and debate was really, really, really valuable. And just helped, it helps you tremendously, and helped me tremendously sort of learn how to think about the world, how to analyze things, how to collect evidence and understand kind of fact from, false claims, and say like, what are the the credentials of this author, what are the warrants of what they're saying, getting into the quality of evidence and that kind of stuff. And so debate really gave me a lot of the tools to start thinking critically and analyzing and saying, okay, well, yeah, I heard that on the news or I read that, but like, what's the source for this story, and what did that source actually say, and maybe they might be biased, and kind of getting into some of those rabbit holes. And so those were some interesting experiences as a child that I think have all kind of coalesced into how I think about the world, and really inform in many ways the show, and kind of our focus on evidence-based growth, and trying to figure out, okay, what are the truth claims behind what this person is saying, and are those based in evidence? Are they based in science? Is it sort of validated in some way by research? Or in some instances, is it, not every single episode we have is hard science. And so sometimes it's more about, okay, is it validated by clinical experience, or their, tremendous work history, or whatever it might be. But I think those experiences really formed me, and kind of made me think about just why it's really important to understand your own biases, your own perspectives, and also when you hear a claim from somebody else, why is that necessarily the case, or why is that true?
Man, the more I do these podcasts and realize I have to start with those experiences to really get the story behind the person's passion and their work. And the more I do it, it makes so much sense. I'm sitting here listening, like, of course that's what this guy's childhood was like, leading him into this arena of self-improvement and growth. There's so many things I'd love to potentially unpack. I excuse me, I do find it interesting you mentioned the homeschooling environment. And I think one of the things I realized and talked to a lot of people about is the relative inefficiency of school. I mean, what you just pointed out was like, look, I worked less, maybe not even necessarily, harder, but I worked smarter and was ahead of people. So much of school is this you waiting on someone else's bad behavior, or waiting, in line to get to someplace. And there's so much inefficiency in that environment. And you're just like living proof that, yeah, I did more and learned to think more critically with a shorter period of time. And there's a lot of things that I could, delve into about education, but I just figured wanted to get your thoughts on that idea since you brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important point. And there's a ton of things that have been written about this broader point, which is like, school and the way that it's designed, basically beats the creativity and thoughtfulness and curiosity out of people. Right, through a long and sort of rigorous gauntlet, like just mercilessly stamps out all of the kind of creative and curious spark that's in sort of innately in every child. And so to me, like, that's something I think about a lot, and I'm actually expecting my first child right now. And so, like, I don't know if we'll homeschool them or not, or maybe partially, or maybe, for a couple months a year or something, but I really think that, like, it worries me when I look at kind of the modern day school system. And I mean, obviously there's some schools that are great, but I think by and large, there's some tremendous challenges with our educational system. And I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in that by any means, but it's something that I definitely think about.
Well, first, congratulations on the baby to be.
Thank you.
Really exciting. I just actually finished my obstetric rotation, so it was in the world of new babies and new life. So it's really exciting. And yeah, I don't want to spend all of our time in the education realm, because we could get totally lost there. But there's certainly some discussions that need to be had. I know for me in medical school, I was actually quite lucky that our education was quite self-directed. The first 2 years were very free and open. They gave us a lot of material and said, these are the important things to know, but didn't really, tell you necessarily how you needed to do it. And I found for myself, I needed to be surrounded by an auditory environment. So I would listen to the lectures while I was walking in the woods, and then go and handwrite my notes and try to get off the computer as much as possible. But this sort of self-directed environment. And I learned so much and was able to explore my creative, curious passions in this relatively free environment. And it just, it allowed me to flourish. And I sometimes scare people and tell them that a lot of what I do on a daily basis in medicine is not something that I learned like in a classroom, or was even presented to me by my medical school. It was from my own curiosity, my own exploration. And I think we're getting to a point. I have a colleague that he's trying to sort of turn medical school on its head and get rid of those first 18 months, 2 years, to make it so people can almost do that on their own time through various electronic means, electronic texts, adaptive learning programs, what have you. But we're getting to an age, and I think podcasts are a great example, where people can become, relatively quite wise and an expert in a field, or learn quite a bit from various sources for free if they're able to sort of utilize some of the tools to kind of weed through the trash, so to speak, or the distractions. And maybe that's a potential segue for you to talk about ways that we can engage with our technological world and get the most out of all that information that's out there to really better ourselves, grow in our education and understanding and overall our capacity to give to others.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question with a lot of stuff to unpack. I mean, I think I'd start with the idea that, and this comes back a little bit to the education topic, is this idea that I think you have to be successful in today's world, you have to be a self-directed learner, right? And if you look at adult andragogy, which is basically the study of adult learning, self-direction is like one of the key components of that. So you have to be curious about it. You have to be able to apply it to your life in some way, and you need to be kind of motivating yourself. And I think that's in some ways, people who are self-learners are almost self-learners in spite of school kind of droning it out of them to some degree. And so I think a lot of people get out of school and they're like, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with that anymore. Whereas like I'm an incredibly active learner. Like I'm always trying to learn more information, put as much knowledge into my brain as possible, even to the point where I'm currently kind of finishing up a dive into kind of the combination of memory techniques and speed reading, and kind of merging those together so that I can not only remember more, but also consume more and learn more rapidly. And so, I always have like a stack of books sitting on my desk. I always want to read and digest more and more information. And so I think to succeed in today's world, when there's so much noise, so much clutter, and so many easy distractions, stuff like Facebook and Twitter and all these kind of low value ways that you can spend your time, I think you absolutely have to be self-directed. And I think you have to be really focused on where you allocate that time and how you sort of spend your learning time. If you look at some of the most successful people in history, people like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or others, they spend a tremendous amount of time reading. Warren Buffett spends like 80% of his time reading and just reads and reads and reads and reads and consumes knowledge. And yet he's one of the wealthiest people on the planet because his ability to think and understand is so advanced. It's almost like compound interest for your brain, right? Like he builds and builds and builds on that knowledge. And we can get deeper into this kind of toolkit. I've actually spent a ton of time thinking and sort of studying people like Warren Buffett and his business partner, Charlie Munger, and others to kind of understand what underpins the way they make decisions and the way that they think about the world, and what are kind of the components of that have made them so successful. And I think a big piece of it, and kind of two pieces of it, is this idea of studying things that change very slowly over time, right? Which is and studying things that have kind of innate, long-lasting, tangible value, right? And so that would be the kind of example I'll give is if you're studying something like economics or psychology or the hard sciences, like getting into that information, that knowledge is going to be really relevant and really useful for a long time. And something like psychology is so relevant and underpins so much of human behavior. If you study psychology, you can practically apply that to things like marketing and sales, and it's really, really relevant and helpful. But if you do the reverse, so if kind of coming from a high level, if you study the principles and the foundations and the fundamentals, you can invent the tactics and the strategies. But if you spend all your time reading articles about like the top 7, new Facebook marketing hacks or whatever, like that information is going to be completely irrelevant in a year, 2 years, 5 years, right? Like if somebody 10 years ago wanted to be a really successful marketer and they spent a bunch of time studying banner ads, hours and hours and hours, like that's 0% relevant today, right? But if they spent that time studying human behavior and what the science and the data says about human behavior, that information is still really relevant. And so that if you look at the way that knowledge develops and the way that memories form, when you build this kind of lattice work of knowledge and information, you can stack more knowledge on top of it. There's kind of a saying that's like, the more you know, the more you can know. Because if you have knowledge, the way that memories form, it's all very associative, right, in the brain. And so if you have an existing structure of knowledge, you can actually like glom more knowledge onto that more easily. And so if you have knowledge that's really relevant and foundational to understanding the way the world works, the way money flows, the way, the mathematics of things like compound interest or the 80-20 principle, or things like game theory work, or things like psychology, all of these kind of really foundational fundamentals, if you dig into that stuff, that's going to carry a ton of the freight and going to be super, super valuable for helping you think and helping you better understand reality. And, that circles back to this idea of kind of compound interest for the mind. If you're studying those really foundational things and spending your time studying stuff like that, that's going to continue to be relevant and your knowledge is going to build. If you're studying stuff that changes really rapidly and that's kind of very ephemeral, or if you're spending your time reading Facebook updates or on Twitter or whatever else, that stuff is really rapidly decaying information, right? That information decays really quickly and has no value. And so you can't build a foundation on top of that and use that as an increased network of knowledge that you can use to better understand the world. And so when you come back and look at somebody like a Warren Buffett or a Bill Gates, part of the reason they're so successful is because they've built this immense knowledge base of long-lasting, relevant information and what they call mental models, which are basically these concepts from the major kind of academic disciplines. And they've built this incredible framework of these mental models so that they can continue to add to them. And so that's how they've become more and more and more and more high leverage with their time, where they still spend a tremendous amount of time reading, but when they do work, they're creating not 10x, not 100x, but like millions of times more value than you or me or someone, an average person.
Wow, there's a couple of things I wanted to unpack from there, things that came up in that answer. That's such a great answer, and I hope people actually maybe go back and listen to that again and sort of see so many layers of complexity there that we can break down as we go into the podcast. But that is so essential in terms of, what are the types of things that you're looking at? That idea of sort of rapidly decaying information or things that are only going to be relevant for a short period of time. I've sort of found that in medicine, I don't like to spend my time learning things that I think are going to be obsolete in 5 years. It's like, why am I going to learn about a process or learn things that are really not going to be applicable? How about I spend my time focused on becoming an expert in things that are quite enduring? And that's where actually some of the interesting ideas of Eastern medicine traditions and medicine traditions, Ayurveda, things that have been around for a very long time and are still relevant. Like, I'm actually kind of curious to explore those areas more than some of the things that, in 10 years, we're probably not even going to be doing that surgery, or that medicine's not even going to be relevant because it's going to be off the market. So that idea of like relevance and rapidly decaying value is very, very important. And then this idea of mental models and conceptual frameworks, I completely agree. I try to spend most of my time getting conceptual frameworks to be able to critically analyze data and to think critically about things that are coming into my sphere of reference. And I'm really not that interested in concrete information as much as those mental models. Like you said, I think that's the biggest thing we're maybe sort of getting out of people through schooling is they don't have a space to be creative and develop a mental model, a creative model, and they're being just filled and overwhelmed with things to memorize. And then the last thing I thought was kind of curious, something I've come across recently in terms of like reading comprehension. So I love the idea that you're right, reading more is going to allow you to think more critically. It's a gentleman, I think he's actually a researcher at the University of Virginia, looking at what's really behind reading comprehension. And we talk about like level 1 reading book or level 2 reading book. And everyone probably remembers all that shenanigans of elementary school. And what he's really looking at is actually reading comprehension isn't really related to some of the things we classically think. It's actually about the context of what the person's reading, right? If they know more about what they're reading, they're going to understand it exponentially more. And so I think that's probably the phenomenon you're describing here. And I would love to maybe get your thoughts, like expanding perhaps on that idea, and then delving into maybe some things in that toolkit that you've been creating as a way to kind of exponentially expand our capacity to take in information.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super relevant, and there's kind of two different ways that context is really important for retaining information and understanding it more effectively. One is, as I touched on a second ago, like the way your brain stores memories is all in these associative networks. And so when you already have a bunch of context and information about something, it's really easy to plug in a new piece of information. And so when you activate that network, you can kind of access all the different pieces that you're thinking about it. But there's even this strategy, and this is one of the things that I've been recently really kind of studying and learning. And if you look at the greatest like memory champions and people who can memorize like 10 decks of cards in 5 minutes and that kind of stuff, these are all feats that are very doable. And there's a book called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer that goes into a lot of this stuff. And he's got a TED Talk, and if you like, you can look into this, and all these people say like it's not that they're born with these crazy memories, it's that they use memory techniques that actually engage the way the human brain is supposed to collect and utilize information. And so if you think about from an evolutionary standpoint, the most effective methods of remembering information and the ones that kind of evolution selected for because they led to a higher survival rate were people who had really good visual and spatial memories. And so, if you remembered where you buried those berries last winter, you can come back and find them, you're more likely to survive and you're more likely to reproduce, et cetera. And so we actually have these really good spatial and visual memories. And so that's, if you can convert information into a visual spatial marker or kind of component that you can then put into your memory, it's really, really powerful way to remember stuff. And so that the way that manifests is like, it looks like these kind of weird, goofy images that you can create in your mind and use to encode information so that your mind remembers it really, really effectively. And I'm happy to kind of give you some examples or go into that. But the whole idea is basically like if you're reading a book about, I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm reading this book about this fighter pilot right now, this dude named John Boyd, who's an absolute badass. Like, highly recommend that book. It's really, really interesting. But when you're reading something and you come across like a passage, that if you have a bunch of knowledge about it, you can start to think about visual markers that you could associate with that information, and then you can create these really vivid images in your head that will help you remember something. And here's a really good example of something that I did recently. I recently finished reading the Leonardo da Vinci biography by Walter Isaacson. Really fascinating stuff. And I'm a big biography reader in general. And I use these memory techniques to memorize. At the back of the book, there's basically this thing that's like 20 lessons from Leonardo's life. And using these memory markers, and I can walk you through like what some of my markers are, but like using them, I have all 20 of them memorized backwards and forwards, and I could easily rattle them all off, and even walk you through like what the memory, the memory technique that I use to remember them is, and explain how I kind of tied those markers into those concepts.
Man, well, since we're here and you want to share that, I'm sure people are probably like burning, like, oh, I need to like know what he's doing. You've provided a little framework for like a visual spatial understanding. But would you mind explaining a little bit more, specifically what you utilize in terms of a technique to dig into?
Yeah, and I'm definitely not like a memory expert by any means, but we interviewed a guy a couple of weeks ago named Jonathan Levy, who's really sharp about a lot of these memory techniques and strategies. And we have an upcoming interview. I don't know when our interview is going to air, but we've got an upcoming interview in a couple of weeks with this guy named Kevin Horsley, who's like an international memory grandmaster, and he memorized pi to 10,000 digits and like all this crazy stuff. And he also shares a lot of these memory strategies and goes really deep into some concrete examples. So I'll give you my kind of brief summary of it, but on the show, The Science of Success, we have a lot more people who are actually memory experts that are really qualified kind of talking about this stuff. But basically, so here's what I memorized. The 20 lessons from Leonardo da Vinci's life. So I used a combination of a technique called a memory palace, which is where you take a physical space and plant like ridiculous or kind of life-size images in that physical place, and then you sort of mentally traverse it and come across the images that you placed in there, and it's actually really, really easy to remember them. So like Leonardo da Vinci's from Italy, right? And so a couple years ago, I took a vacation, stayed at this villa in Tuscany, and I can still remember the villa like really, really clearly. And if you think about your spatial memory, like if you think back to your childhood house or your childhood home, right? Like you can probably remember almost the entire layout of that house really, really clearly. Like you could probably even think about what was on your wall in your room and all this kind of stuff, right? And that's because we have really powerful spatial memories. And so I remember this villa, and starting walking up to the villa, there was this huge, steep dirt road. And so on the dirt road, I see a cat like relentlessly trying to climb up the road. And so the cat stands for curiosity. And so it's relentless curiosity. So that's the first lesson, is be relentlessly curious. Then when I get to the top of the driveway, I see a giant copy of one of my favorite books, which is this book called Seeking Wisdom, which the second one, that's sort of to remind me of the second one, is to seek knowledge. And then when I look to the right, I see there's this painting that I have a really clear image of. It's called Wonder, and there's like children hanging off of the side of it, and so that's the marker that helps me remember have childlike wonder. So then I turn and I walk into the villa, and there's like a mini telescope observatory. You know, like the observatories that like look out at the stars. It's like sitting in the lobby of the house. So I see that observatory, and I know, okay, be observational, observe the world around you. That's the next memory. Then I walk into the dining room, and I walk through a giant D that has a dog's tail that's wagging. And so that's focus on the details, right? And so I'll give you a couple more just to kind of give you how I think about these markers. So the next one on the table in that room is Harry Potter with a cloak of invisibility. And that stands for see the unseen, right? And then in the fireplace, there's a giant rabbit hole with a big rabbit in it, and that stands for go down rabbit holes. And then when I look into the kitchen, there's a giant shiny object that's kind of blocking my path, and so that stands for get distracted, right? And I could keep going, like, so that's what, like 5 or 6 of them, but those are the kind of images that I use to tie into those concepts. And so now, whenever I want to remember, what were the 20 strategies that Leonardo da Vinci used or not that he used, but like what did Walter Isaacson say, or like the 20 lessons from Leonardo da Vinci's life, or sort of things you should apply to your life, I have them all memorized, right? And so that's the kind of strategy for, you basically take a concept that you want to remember, you tie it into what's called a visual marker, which is basically what I was describing, like a giant letter D with a tail, right, for the word details. Or really it's just whatever your mind conjures up that you think kind of fits that marker. And you can do all kinds of creativity training exercises and word association exercises and stuff to build that memory and build that ability to make visual markers really quickly. But that's just an example of how you can encode information in a spatial and visual way so that you can remember it more effectively, and so that I can kind of like hang that information in my head in a way that's effortlessly easy to retrieve. Like, it doesn't take me any energy to say, oh yeah, I'm walking down the hallway and I see a giant grain silo, and that stands for don't get siloed. And then I see a dragon and a knight fighting in the hallway, and that stands for, fantasize and like, believe in fantasy. Like, all of these different images and themes from the book are encoded really easily into this sort of visual memory palace that I've created in my head.
Wow, I loved going along that journey with you. And it kind of brings me back almost full circle to how we're learning. I was taking that journey with you, and I could say I remember so much more about those lessons from your journey, kind of like living it through your eyes, the way you described it, rather than you just like listing them off to me. I would have,
and you don't even know what the building looks like, right? But you could probably,
I have no idea.
You could probably even do them in the reverse order that I gave them to you, right?
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. I hope people, I need to start employing a little, more of this in my life. And I hope people also realize the things that you were, quote unquote, memorizing were these bigger conceptual frameworks, these ideas. You weren't memorizing, some silly fact using, you can, like these things like memorizing pi and these things are kind of, esoteric things. But what you use, and the reason you use it is because you wanted to ingrain certain essential values and conceptual ideas that you want to make a part of your life. And I think that's the most relevant piece of this, right? We could use these techniques to remember kind of silly things that aren't as applicable to our life, but just watching you go through that and seeing the relevance of why you wanted to make that a part of your memory was powerful to me. So we've already spent so much time in this space. There's so many things I'd love to get into. I know we're gonna sort of have a little bit of a want to have a little bit of a discussion back to, you mentioned a couple of people you've had on the podcast, and this relative success, this growth of this podcast being a little more than you even expected. And I've listened to quite a few, having just come across your podcast quite recently, but was curious, having gone through this, what are the types of guests, what are the types of people that you're seeking out as part of this podcast, and how do you go about, having discussions with these people? Because I'm quite fascinated by some of their backgrounds and some of the knowledge that they're providing, and was curious how that process sort of started and it's continued.
Yeah, so the way it started and the way that it kind of operates today, I think, are a little bit different. When it started out, I basically just set out a list of a lot of my favorite bloggers, authors, researchers, TED Talks that I liked, that kind of stuff, and said like, oh, I'm going to reach out to these people and just see if I can interview them. And in the beginning, it was a lot harder to find kind of bigger name guests, and I kind of had a few people that just sort of fell into my lap by chance, or were like, one guest would introduce me to another guest or something like that. But we really started to build traction, and were able to, with the combination of just ambitious asks and constantly trying to reach and get cool people on the show, we're able to eventually land like one or two interesting people, and then we leveraged the kind of social proof and authority that comes, those are principles of influence from Robert Cialdini, by the way, which, going back to the idea of using the tactic, or using the sort of principles to drive the tactics, using the fundamental principles of psychology. We use the kind of the names and the credibility to create social proof and authority, to trigger that bias in people, and then use those names to outreach to more guests and say, oh, well, so-and-so is on the show, and so-and-so is on the show, and our audience is this big now, and so, you should come on too. And so we were able to kind of continue to do that. But, it started out with just kind of, like I said, I just made a list of like, oh, these are some of my favorite authors, these are some of my favorite thinkers, writers, bloggers, etc., and just tried to find an email for them and reach out to them. Today, it's a much more detailed process, and I actually kind of built up a small team around the show. So I have a producer, and I have an assistant, and I have the audio production folks. And so my producer's pretty much exclusively in charge of guest research and guest validation now. And so he does all that work, and I'll basically kind of similar process. He actually has a lot of criteria, and I have great faith in him and his ability to find guests and find really high quality guests. But it's a combination of him doing a bunch of homework and research, and looking through people's backgrounds and their work and trying to find people who are a good fit. And then I'll also just stumble across people and be like, hey, this person looks really interesting, like you should vet them. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're a fit, but I'll come across a paper or a study, or someone will send me an article, and I'll be like, oh, I like what this person's saying, or oh, this is really interesting. Like, let's see if they're a good fit for the show. And also obviously the question is, can we get them on the show? Which is, not necessarily yes in every case, but we like to be ambitious and try to get as many guests as we can. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how it starts out. And really, I just try to find people who I definitely have a strong preference for kind of having some sort of background in science or research or data and what they're talking about and doing. And then in terms of how I think about engaging with them, what questions to ask, that kind of stuff, it honestly comes back to the first lesson from the Da Vinci book. And if you read the Einstein biography, it's really the same thing, which is be curious. And the more curious you are, curiosity, I think, really, really drives great interviews. And I think the more curious you are about somebody, and just, the more you dig in, I think the better your interview is going to be. And the second piece of that, I'd say curiosity is number one, and I'd say listening is number two. So we have kind of, in our show, like I let the guests do the vast majority of the talking. And I actually tell them before the interview, we have kind of a pre-show thing that we go through, and I tell them, you're the star of the show. I want you to go deep. I want you to explain. I want you to tell stories. I want you to share examples from research and studies and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, if you're going deep on something, don't feel like you've been talking for too long, or come and ask me, hey, am I talking for too long, or whatever. I want you to shine. I want you to share your knowledge. And so giving those guests that opportunity to really go deep, I think that's, I was actually joking with a guest that I interviewed earlier this week about, she was saying, I'm so glad you said that. It really freed me up to kind of get deeper into things. And she's like, usually I'm trying to consolidate it down into sound bites. And
oh man, yeah,
that's the world we live in today, right? Coming back to this whole thing of like social media and rapidly decaying knowledge and all this stuff. we live in a world of sound bites and headlines and those kind of things. And the show, it tries to basically be kind of an answer to that and a refutation of that in some ways. We want to be slower. We want to be deeper. We want to get into it a little bit more and stand for something that has more substance than the kind of vapid and clickbaity world that there's so much internet content lives in today.
Well, you're doing a wonderful job of doing that, and I completely, agree. I joke. I often tell the guests I'm interviewing, before, that TED Talk that you haven't given yet, or that's in your head, or all those ideas and those stories, like you just said, just go with them, share them. Please, have no filter. And it's funny that you shared that you had a guest that was able to be more open, having you just simply say that. And I think, kind of remove that filter, because I'm trying to hold the same kind of space. I think we're trying to be more deliberate, more purposeful, more reflective, and get away as far away as we can from those sort of baity headlines and the 2 or 3 minute YouTube video that supposedly is all we have, capacity to pay attention to anymore.
Right.
But of all the people that you've interviewed so far, and I'm sure you have so many more people that you're getting ready to talk to, what has been perhaps the 1 or 2 biggest lessons that you have then taken into your life and turned into a practical, habit change, or something that you've done that's made a radical difference in the way that you see the world, but also sort of live in the world?
Yeah, I'll give you the 2 biggest themes that recur again and again. But before I dive into that, I would say just a smaller one is just this memory stuff, right? Like I have always kind of I was like, oh yeah, mind maps and memory palaces and all this stuff. Like, yeah, I should get into that at some point. And then I started interviewing a couple of these memory experts, and I was like, man, I really need to do that. Like, I'm missing a big opportunity to not only learn and remember way more, but hopefully using, some speed reading or just improving my reading speed, even digest more information more frequently. So that's kind of a micro example of something recently that's been really top of mind for me for the last month or two. But zooming out, I would say the 2 biggest themes that have come across again and again and again and again in the show, and these are coming from literally everybody from astronauts to FBI hostage negotiators to neuroscientists to some of the world's top psychology experts and authors. The 2 biggest themes. One is self-awareness basically underscores every other skill in the 21st century. If you're self-aware, you can improve, you can see your own mistakes, you can grow, you can get better, you can get stronger, you can see where you're going wrong and you can correct it. If you're not self-aware, you can't improve, you constantly self-sabotage, you constantly in a place of making blame and excuses, externalizing your failures, and you basically get trapped into a cycle of repeating the same types of behaviors and you end up plateauing or failing. So that's the number 1 biggest theme. And that's been tremendously impactful for me. And, things like mindfulness and meditation and all that kind of stuff and journaling are really good tools to cultivate more self-awareness. The second one is and this has maybe had a bigger, I was already, I'm not like preaching that I'm the most self-aware person ever. I think even the most self-aware people still aren't that self-aware. And I think that's kind of the catch-22 of self-awareness is like, it's really hard to be self-aware. It's really hard to look at yourself honestly and assess your own mistakes and shortcomings. And the ego makes it really challenging to do that.
Oh yeah.
But I like that was something that I was a little keyed into before the show, but it's honestly surprised me how frequently from such a diverse range of guests that has come up again and again and again. Even to the point where I sought out somebody, a woman named Dr. Tasha Urich, who we interviewed a couple weeks ago, who was like one of the world's foremost self-awareness researchers, because I was like, keep hearing about self-awareness. Like, what do you have to say about it? And it was a really interesting conversation. But the second one, and this is actually probably more impactful for me, more so because I was like not as far along on this journey, which is how to deal with negative emotions. And the 2 biggest takeaways from this that I've learned from the show, and this is again from talking to all kinds of people. One of my favorite interviews on that was this guy named Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who he taught the most popular class in Harvard's history, which is on happiness. And he's really, really sharp guy. Another interview that really changed my perspective on this and kind of the concept of emotional perfectionism was this woman named Megan Bruneau. But the big thing I learned about negative emotions, there's kind of two main takeaways. One is that negative emotions are unavoidable. And so if you try to avoid negative emotions, if you try to, be happy all the time, be in a good mood all the time, what you'll actually do is create this expectation, and this is essentially the idea of emotional perfectionism, that you have to be in a positive emotional state all the time. And so when you're not, it can create a spiral of negative emotions, being anxious because you're anxious, being angry because you're angry, right? And this can be really, really negative. And so we have this ridiculous belief that we need to be happy all the time, or we need to be in a good mood all the time, and that's just not possible. Even Tal Ben-Shahar, a Harvard PhD, who's one of the top experts on happiness, says you cannot be happy all the time, and you shouldn't. And to be happy and live a happy life, you have to experience negative emotions. And so negative emotions are inevitable. That's one of the biggest lessons I've learned from the show. And the second piece is that emotions are data, but not direction. And that's the idea that you can learn from your emotions, and they're trying to tell you something important, but that doesn't mean you need to do what they're saying, right? There's data there, there's important information, but that doesn't mean you need to react emotionally and kind of do what your emotions are telling you to do. But you need to listen to why they're trying to tell you to do that, if that makes sense. And one of my favorite kind of interviews where we went deep into that topic was with this woman named Dr. Denise Shull, who, if you've ever seen the TV show Billions, there's a character on there who's basically like a psychologist for these hedge fund traders. Her name's Wendy Rhodes on the show, and she's kind of like this just badass psychologist who gets them in a performance mindset and solves all these traders' psychology problems. Denise Shull's like the real person that Wendy Rhodes is based on. And she's one of the top trading psychology experts on the planet. And she goes really deep into why emotions are an important part of decision making, and thinking that people who are these Wall Street wizards who are making trades of hundreds of millions of dollars and putting huge amounts of money on the line, to think that they're making these decisions without emotion is not the correct way to think about it. They are using their emotion as a tool to inform, as data to inform how they're making their decisions and making their decisions more effectively. And so those are kind of the two biggest lessons overall that I've learned from the show, which is, again, self-awareness is probably one of the most important skills, and it is a skill that can be learned, is one of the most important skills, and then how to deal with negative emotions. Those, to me, are the two most recurrent themes on the show, and probably the two most valuable things that I've gotten out of the show.
Matt, wow. Thank you so much for just reaching out to me. In your podcast, you tell people that you respond to every email that you get, and you responded so quickly to my inquiry, and I'm just so thankful you agreed to come on to share some of these ideas. Kind of on the other side of the coin, you're such a great interviewer. I figured it'd be a good change of pace for you to be able to share some of your own experiences. And so thank you just for taking the time to share some of these ideas with me and with our audience.
Well, Rob, thank you so much again for having me on here. It's been a pleasure to share these ideas with you and your listeners. And I really do respond to every single listener email. So, I give my email away at the end of every episode of my show. And so if you want to reach out, say hi, whatever, feel free to shoot me an email.
We've been mentioning it from the beginning to all the way here to the end, your podcast, your work, but I want to give you the space now to concretely tell people how they can start following along the podcast, your work, and reach out to really get involved with some of the great stuff that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find the show at successpodcast.com or anywhere that you listen to podcasts that's called The Science of Success. And if you're curious about digging into more kind of the mental models and decision-making stuff that we touched on earlier, I have a free ebook called 4 Steps to Making Better Decisions that you can get for free if you just go to successpodcast.com/better. That's successpodcast.com/better. So that's a topic that I'm super interested in, and I basically compiled a ton of the work that I've done. It has, bunch of different mental models in there, all kinds of different things, lots of stuff from Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and Elon Musk and other stuff. And so that is a really cool resource that I give away for free. So if that's something that sounds up your alley, definitely check that out as well.
I will second that. already have that ebook after finding your podcast. It is really, really practical and extremely helpful. So guys, definitely take them up on that offer. Check it out. It's a great and wonderful resource. So thank you for taking the time to put it together. In the last couple minutes here before you have to go, I usually end each podcast with really kind of an open space for you and for you to be able to share any final thoughts, any stories, other pieces of wisdom, or just a final reflection that you think would benefit the audience.
Yeah, I'll come back to the principle of self-awareness and share with you one of my favorite quotes, which is from the Stanford PhD psychologist. Her name is Dr. Carol Dweck, and she's done a tremendous amount of research, hundreds of thousands of people over a 30-year time horizon, all about what makes people succeed and what makes people fail. And she shares a really simple insight, which is basically the idea that you cannot learn from a mistake if you deny that you made it. And so many of us rob ourselves of the opportunity to learn from our mistakes by blaming other people, by blaming the situation, by creating excuses. So really take a look at what you're doing, maybe a problem you're having or a struggle you're facing, and see how you can take responsibility for it. Because that self-awareness will give you the ability to overcome that challenge.
I think that's a wonderful way to end the show. Her growth mindset and that perspective will take you leaps and bounds ahead of those crippling distractions. So what a wonderful piece of wisdom. Well, thanks, Matt. Please go enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hopefully will figure out a way to cross paths in the future. I know I'm trying to get out to Nashville in October for a couple conferences, so maybe we'll be able to connect in person. So
yeah, definitely let me know if you're in town. And thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.